Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this CARMA Asia webinar to discuss measuring leadership. My name is Andrew Nichols. I'm the Managing Director of CARMA Asia, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Pearl Ong. Hi, Pearl.
Hello, everyone.
Pearl is an analyst in our Singapore team, and she's also the author of our 2020 Singapore CEO report, which we're going to use as the foundation for today's discussion. So if you're currently including leadership measurement, spokesperson measurement in your communications evaluation efforts, or you're thinking about doing that in the future, and hopefully you should find today's discussion interesting and useful. So before I move forward with the discussion around the report, just a quick introduction to CARMA. We're a global media intelligence agency. We service our clients out of 18 international offices, although through our partners and correspondent network, we actually have a presence on the ground in nearly 50 countries. We're a full service operation. We monitor, measure and evaluate media data across all platforms in over 100 languages. We have a team of 500 full-time staff. But we're not simply a technology company. We all know there are lots of software as a service businesses out there providing media monitoring. Media monitoring dashboards simply provide you with data, but we also, in addition to using cutting edge technology, we also have a team of human analysts, just like Pearl, throughout the world, who help our clients make sense of that information, produce monthly, quarterly analysis reports. And we have quite a wide range of clients, over 1,000 clients across the government, non-government, and a range of different commercial sectors, both agency and the brand side. Okay, so some of you may have seen that we launched our 2020 Singapore CEO report last week. I'll be giving the link to download that report for free from our website later on if you haven't yet had a chance to look at it. Essentially what we do is we look at the most valuable brands according to Brand Finance. Brand Finance does a list of most valuable, the 100 most valuable brands across a range of territories. So we take that list, we then look at the top 20, and using our technology, we look at which CEOs from those brands have been featured the most in the media, the most visible CEOs. And we narrow that down to a list of 10, and that's the basis for the 10 CEOs in the report. The period for the reporting is 6 months, so from the 1st of May to the 31st of October. We're looking at both online and social media, and a range of metrics which we'll walk through in a moment. Probably the most important of all of those metrics is our proprietary favorability rating. Pearl, do you want to talk a little bit about I know that the rating is explained in detail and the methodology is explained in detail in the report, but do you want to just give an overview on the favorability rating?
All right, thank you, Andrew. So the CARMA favorability rating system is actually based on a predetermined set of criteria designed to eliminate subjectivity, and we consider 3 main categories. Firstly is the placement of the article, where we look at headlines, photos, length of article. And then second is the message, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. And lastly, the third category is the tone of the article, whether the journalist or media outlet interjected their opinions in the article. And that makes up our CARMA favorability rating system. Thank you.
So it's a 0 to 100 rating, with 100 being perfect communication and 0 being an unmitigated disaster. So let's look at that a little bit further then. If you are going to measure your leadership, then it's probably a good idea to see how often they're mentioned in the media as one of your metrics. So you can see on the left-hand side of the chart here is the volume scale. Underneath is the name of the CEOs in the report. On the right-hand side is the favorability scale. and then the blue bars indicating number of articles mentioning the CEO, and the orange line indicating the favourability. What you can see straight away here, hopefully, is the importance of measuring not just quantitative, but also qualitative data. You can see on the left-hand side that Piyush Gupta, who's the Chief Executive of DBS, has by far the highest visibility. He's mentioned the most during the 6-month period in Singapore media. But at the other end of the scale, Mr. Kwok, who's the CEO of Wilmar, actually has the highest average favourability rating. So even though he wasn't mentioned in as many articles, his communication and the content of those articles led to him having the highest favourability rating. Now, talking my own book for a second, what it also shows you is the benefits of having a slightly more granular way of looking at favourability than a simple binary positive, negative, and neutral scale. If you're looking at month-on-month or quarter-on-quarter reports, you might find that you're just seeing neutral, or positive, for example. But using a scale like this, you'll actually see fluctuations, and you'll be able to look at why that might be. If someone or a brand has moved from neutral to positive, for example, 1 month to the next, that might be quite a big jump, which you wouldn't necessarily see if you were using a more simplified rating. So looking a bit further into the inner pages of the report, I'm using Piyush Gupta's pages here as an example. I'll just walk through the metrics that we used. So on the top left here, you can see the media visibility, which is basically the split between mainstream and social media. Certainly, if we were doing this specifically for a client, or if you were doing this in your organization, you would probably also want to look at things like broadcast and print as well. Below that, you can see the favourability number, as we discussed earlier on. So his favourability is 58, so it's positive. Underneath that, you can see CEO as a brand spokesperson. What we're doing here is we're tracking the total number of articles that mention the brand DBS, and also then separately pointing out how many of those articles actually featured their CEO. And I think across the report, correct if I'm wrong, Pearl, but most of the CEOs were actually featured in less than 5% of their overall brand coverage.
Yeah, it's less than 5%.
Yeah, so I think what that shows is, using the spokesperson strategically, knowing when to engage, I think is pretty key. Even though Piyush was the most visible in close to 100 articles across the period, it was only 4% of overall brand coverage. And then moving to the top right of that page, you can see top attributes. So we found a list of attributes from a Harvard Business Review paper talking about desirable attributes for the chief executives, and we used that as the basis for this report. And then for each CEO, we looked at the 5 most prominent attributes that they displayed in their communication. Now, if you were going to do this for your own CEO, or if you were going to do it for a different range of spokespeople, then you may not just want to have the attributes listed like we have. We've listed them in the order of prominence, but you could, for example, also have them in a bar. You could create a rating there, so then you could show to what extent they displayed, emotional intelligence, for example, benchmarked against a previous month or a rival CEO. Underneath that, we have social media sentiment, and below that, we have media driving activity. But what this is showing a correlation between media coverage gained and Google searches. So in this case, there's an extreme. So 1 would be a perfect correlation, -1 would be a perfect positive correlation, -1 would be a perfectly negative correlation, 0 would be no correlation. In this case, 0.93, Piyush Gupta has an extremely strong correlation between the coverage that was coming out featuring his name and people then searching for him on Google. And below that, you can see some of the searches that they were actually typing in. So you can see it's things like his salary, his net worth, his nationality, his citizenship, etc. What's interesting about looking at search data is typically when people want to know what stakeholders are thinking, what the public is thinking, they will do market research. They'll ask them. They'll look at social media data, etc. And they both have their strengths when used correctly. But one of the things about social media data, for example, is, first of all, not everyone comments on social media, not actually everyone engages. And when people do engage, very often it's a case of saying what they want other people to see, or what they want other people to think about them, not necessarily exactly what their true opinions are. But with search data, you kind of get a quite clear sense of what people are interested in. And you can use tools like Answer the Public. You can also simply look at the drop down of suggestions that you get when you type in a brand name, or in this case, a person's name, and you'll see what the common associated search terms are that Google gives you. Moving on to the next page, then we can see we've also broke down the type of media coverage in terms of proactive, reactive, spontaneous, third-party generated, and we've also pointed out where there were dominant, moderate, or passing mentions. Pearl, do you want to just give us a bit more around that, please?
All right, so it's also interesting to be able to segregate the different types of media coverage. So that's what we did. So for proactive, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's proactively generated by the company, like press releases. And for reactive, it's a form of proactive, but it's more of the company reacting or commenting on a specific issue that might be on industry or a crisis that came up. Spontaneous is what it is, as journalists and media publication deciding to write about the company. So it can be an industry analysis where they talk about different companies in general and the CEO is mentioned. And then third party is another company or organization or government body generating the articles proactively. Apart from those, we also look at the prominence of the coverage, like dominant. So dominant is whereby the CEO, for this instance, is mentioned more than 50% of the article, or if they are doing an exclusive interview. Moderate is around 20 to 30% of the article, and passing is probably like 5% of the article. We also take into consideration the length of the article to determine the percentages. So that's a pretty good way to segment your media coverage.
Sure. So we can see here that it probably makes sense then that quite a lot of the passing coverage was in spontaneous coverage, passing mentions in spontaneous coverage, but actually about a third of Pierce's, the coverage featuring Pierce, was actually proactively generated. Underneath that, you can see things like leading topics and factors that contributed towards favourability. So again, this is about applying qualitative information on top of quantitative information. So having got all this coverage, what was actually being discussed? And these are really the factors that are helping to drive reputation. So things like financial performance are mentioned, shares are mentioned. You might expect that from the CEO of a bank, but also this issue of his nationality, which was questioned in discussion in Parliament and was then played out in the media as well as in social media. So quite important to keep an eye on these type of reputational drivers. And we've also highlighted what areas were driving favourability, including some of DBS's COVID-19 relief efforts, hiring, I think, up to 2,000 people this year in Singapore. They were also awarded Best Bank in the World by Global Finance. So a lot of that has been proactively generated by DBS, and in a way that's helped not necessarily directly counter, but it's helped to impact the overall favourability when some of those articles that may not have been proactively generated have perhaps contributed to more negative sentiment. That be about right, Pearl?
Yes, that's correct, Andrew. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next slide. So the third page for each one of the CEOs focuses on social media. So here again, we're looking at, similarly to the previous page, in this case, we're looking at top conversational drivers. So what are people mostly talking about, and which factors are driving sentiment. So in this case, you know, we had negative sentiment. What has contributed to that? and so on, for positive and neutral. For anyone that is interested, on the right-hand side, we've also included the CEOs in order of highest social media engagement. The reason there is only 8 as opposed to 10 is because 2 of the CEOs received absolutely no social media engagement whatsoever. One of the things that's interesting here is that the top 4 mirror the top 4 in terms of online visibility, with although 1 and 2 are switched around. So I just want to pick up on the point I made earlier on about a correlation coefficient between something like your online media mentions, or indeed media mentions on any platform, and then an action by the public, by a group of stakeholders. So this example is clearly a consumer durable, but you can imagine, for example, you could be looking at announcements made by your CEO. If you're a company that uses spokespeople a lot to talk about new product launches, for example, then this would be extremely applicable. The line at the top shows the coverage in terms of total impressions for a particular period, in this case for the Honda E. Below that, you can see the number of searches in the UK for the Honda E over the same period of time. Now, that comes so the top line would come from your media monitoring provider. The second line would come from Google Trends. One thing to note about this is that it's not an absolute number, so it's not the actual number of searches. If you use Google Trends, it's a free open source tool, but what it does is it gives you a relative number. So if you look at that particular period of time, it'll make the highest number of searches 100, no searches would be 0, and then it gives you a relative rating for that period. But with that, you can create a correlation coefficient like this one. Underneath the searches, you can see the number of organic searches, the organic search traffic that's actually arrived on the honda.co.uk website. You could also use things like social media engagement as well here, footfall, a whole range of different indicators. But the idea is to show communications driving outcomes in the organization. And if you are going to measure leadership, it's a great idea to benchmark your leadership against your competitors. This is dummy data on this slide, but the idea here is that you've got a number of leaders from competitors being benchmarked against each other. You can also do this for internal spokespeople, so you could have your CMO, CEO, etc. I know professional services companies do tend to utilize spokespeople, managing partners quite a lot throughout different regions. So it could help with things like supporting media training. And the metrics you can see here include the CARMA IQ score, which takes the favorability rating we discussed earlier on, and then combines it with reach relative to your target audience. Then we have the favorability rating, then we have the volume of articles, and then a number of metrics looking at sort of impact of each one of those articles, dominance, etc. Then we're also looking at key themes. So this would be a good way to see things like share of expert commentary. For example, if you're a B2B company, then things like share of expert commentary might be something that you would like to look at. Certainly key messages to see if you're doing the internal thing, see who's staying on message, etc. And in this example, which I've redacted slightly, we can see that the client is tracking their own, rectangle in the middle is a list of their own spokespeople and their competitors' spokespeople, and then we're tracking the engagement across different territories. Okay, so again, you probably would want to overlay this with more qualitative information. So not only where are they getting the most pickup or engagement in a particular territory, but also, for example, what might the favorability be in that territory. And as I mentioned at the start, if you would like to download the 2020 CEO report, you can do so from this link here. I will pause now to see if anybody has Any questions?
I think we have a question from the floor from Mr. Syed. He asked which social media platform would be suitable for a CEO? Definitely not TikTok, right? And is there an engagement benchmark for each platform? For example, the use of Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube, etc.
So I think it would depend on the CEO, and it would depend on what your company strategy was and what you were trying to achieve. I think there probably are some CEOs out there for whom TikTok would be suitable. The type of CEOs that we have in our list here actually don't generally actively communicate much themselves on social media. One of the things we thought about doing for this report is looking into that, but we found that the majority of them are not particularly active on social media. So a strategic decision there, perhaps. In this case, when we were looking at the engagement, it was members of the public actually posting or commenting about CEOs. Pearl, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just think that it's also, apart from depending on the CEO, it's also depending on the region itself. So for Singapore, a lot of the comments we take from is forums. Forums is where a lot of the public go to talk about the different articles. And then if it's in Hong Kong, then we wouldn't look at, like, if in another region like Hong Kong, we wouldn't look at forums. We might look more into like Weibo, some like outlets that where the public use the most to talk about the specific CEOs. So there are many ways we do it. It's really dependent. There's so many variables to it. So it's really dependent on where it is, what country it is.
Yeah, the approach I would always take with any kind of question, with any process like that, where to communicate is what is the most reputationally relevant platform. You know, whether that's the FT or whether it's TikTok is going to depend on the brand or the spokesperson that you're working with. Any more questions, Vivian? Oh, sorry, Pearl, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to add on also, like we would for social media, it's actually quite interesting to look more to the earned media part of it, where the people perception of the CEO and their reaction to the media coverage. So that's what we did for this report. We felt like where we looked into the earned media, as CEOs don't really post, not all CEOs post a lot on social media. So looking at what people talk about might be a good approach to certain CEOs or other CEOs. We can look at both owned and earned media. Yeah, so that's one part that we can look into social media too.
Just one more question from the floor. How do you calculate engagement in social media?
Pearl, do you want to take that one?
Okay, so for social media that we calculated via it is inclusive of comments. So we looked at forums and Twitter, for example, for this report. So engagement comes into comments, retweets, likes, like sharing. So all of this are counted into engagement purposes for it. That's how we would calculate for engagement. But for Facebook, for example, it will include also the same thing, the comments, likes, and shares. So depending on the platform.
Okay, one more question. Would there be two sets of social media strategies then? One for the corporate brand and one for the CEO persona? And if so, should there be a one or two-man team dedicated just for the CEO?
Again, it would really depend on so many things. I don't think I could give a generic answer as to whether you need one or two people to manage a CEO. I do take the point about having energy focused on brand and then potentially separately thinking about what the communication strategy using the CEO might be. Spokespeople need to be used strategically, like we pointed out earlier in the discussion. Across all of these CEOs of Singapore's most valuable brands, even the one that was featured the most was still only featured in 4% of their coverage, and most of them were featured in less than 5% of their coverage. That means that they are making a decision to spearhead an initiative, to make a comment or not to. And I think that that's a discussion that their comms team obviously are having. And in some cases, there are CEOs that try not to be very present in the media. And again, that might relate to the particular industry or the product that they're operating with. And there are other cases where CEOs are effectively brand influencers. And if you're successful at positioning your CEO as such, then certainly you might find that staff retention could be impacted positively. Share price, potentially investor sentiment is likely to be stronger for a CEO that they trust, of course, and recruitment as well. If you have a CEO that's a strong influencer for the brand and has a high favorability rating, for example, then that might lead to more people wanting to work with a company helmed by such a person. Likewise, potential business partnerships, government associations, etc. So there's a whole range of benefits that are available to utilizing your CEO strategically, depending on your industry and what you're trying to achieve. But of course, as to whether it should be one or two people, as the person asked the question, I think it would really depend.
All right, I don't see any further questions coming in. Does anyone else want to raise any more concerns or have any other inquiries? If you are afraid to do so publicly, then feel free to always drop us a line. We'll be more than happy to take a conversation privately with you guys.
Certainly. Well, I think then I'll just finally say thank you very much for all of you for joining us. We're delighted to have you join us today, and thank you also to the PRCA, our partners, and thank you to Pearl and Vivian